Welcome to the New Books Network.
Think about it. Deep conversations with Uli Baer on big ideas and great books. So I'm sitting here with John Waters, a clinical associate professor at New York University, where we actually have a program in Irish studies, at least an Ireland house. Welcome, John, to Think About It. And one of the areas of expertise is Irish literature, culture, history. So we're here today to talk about James Joyce, this collection of short stories, Dubliners. First of all, thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure, Uli. Looking forward to it very much, yeah.
And you're the first guest after about 2 years to be back in person.
Yeah, that feels very good, I must say. Yeah, it's good to see you in person and live and not be through a screen. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it walking over here. Dubliners is such a collection of such visceral stories.
Yes.
Very palpable. You get a real sense of Dublin, and maybe you can start us out a little bit by talking a little bit where the stories are situated, what Dublin is. I have to confess, I've only been to Dublin once.
Yes.
I recorded a Beckett episode in Dublin, actually, at Trinity College.
I'd heard of it, yeah.
Which was a lot of fun, but it's today a very beautiful, curated, gorgeous city.
Yes.
Lots of international tourists. Parts of it are just sort of the most picturesque things, but I don't think it was that.
No, indeed, yeah. It's utterly transformed from even the city that I lived in the mid-1980s when I first went to school in Dublin, and certainly from the city that James Joyce lived in, which was notable for having the worst slums in all of Western Europe. Dublin had endemic tuberculosis. It had fallen really remarkably from the heights of the late 18th century, when it was really the second city of the British Empire. After the Act of Union removed the Irish Parliament to Westminster and abolished the Irish Parliament, the political class and the resident landlord class largely moved out of the city, and the grand squares and houses of Georgian Dublin over time became tenements, especially on the north side of the city. And by the time that James Joyce was a young man, Dublin really had an entrenched problem of dilapidated housing and overcrowding. That affected Joyce himself personally in an interesting way that I think really filters into these stories and the observations that he has on urban life, primarily in the sense that the Joyce family was a downwardly mobile family themselves, right? So James Joyce's father, John Stanislaus Joyce, was someone who never settled into a profession. He inherited some land, had pretensions of grandeur, had been to university in Cork, but was a drinker and a talker, a political maneuverer, and also a Catholic who had 11 children in 12 years. Wow. And James Joyce was the oldest, and so Joyce grew up when the family was wealthy. That enabled the father to send him to Clongowes Wood School, which was the premier boarding school for Catholic young men. It was a Jesuit institution, and Joyce was a remarkably talented, gifted, brilliant human being. But over time, Joyce was able to go to Clongowes for several years, but then the family finances utterly cratered. And that began, first Joyce was removed from there and placed in local schools in Dublin, which were significantly less august than Clongowes. But more importantly, the family started to move. They lost their house in South Dublin, the very salubrious, beautiful, leafy part of the city, and began moving in a big circular series around the city up to the north side. And that's where Joyce became really intimate with poverty. And I think that double lens really informs his experience of the city in a lot of ways, and the idea that as a teenager, he grew up with a memory of being secure and wealthy, but witnessing his family's disintegration and poverty. And then thinking about that, as a young man, he could see the larger social forces of decay to which his family was then kind of becoming subject. So I think all of his observations about the differences between the north and the south side of the city, concentrated poverty on the north, cosseted, culturally clotted and sclerotic politics and culture of the south side of the city. All of that really filters into the stories as we can get into when we...
And how does he see himself once the family's kind of fallen into poverty? He said the family moved so many times. He's the oldest of 10 surviving kids, right?
Yeah, that's right. You touch on such an interesting question about Joyce's self-observation, because as I understand, the power of the writing comes from an utterly astonishing ability of withdrawal and of an observational clinical detachment. Mm-hmm. And this manifests itself in a lot of different ways in Joyce's work, but specifically with the sense that psychologically and emotionally, the ability to remove himself and yet to be observant and yet to look at life as it was actually lived and to try to think about the different fantasies. I think his father was a bit of a fantasist and someone who created narratives of his past and of his present and victim structure for thinking about how his life had gone. And I think James Joyce was able ultimately to question sort of everything about the social structure of Irish life, but I think by extension, the bourgeois constructions of the Victorian era in Europe more generally, and to really to cultivate that sense of a clinical detachment.
And it includes this detachment it includes other people's psychology or interior lives. So it's this incredibly detailed, precise observation of things and details and what people eat and how much they pay and where they sit and what their clothes are made of and what the banister of the stairs are like. But then also the psychology, which is not his knowledge. So you think it's really interesting. There's a kind of clinical detachment that he can see himself probably also in a way, but he can see other people almost as if he sees them doing something and then he sees whatever we call the motivation or the drives or desires or fears behind that.
I think part of what you're referring to here has to do with the fact that Joyce wrote most of his work. The vast majority of his work was written after he left Ireland.
Yeah.
And many of the questions about how he thought of how other people lived in Ireland were motivated by the question of what would he have become had he stayed.
So tell us when he leaves and so he's a young man in Dublin and first of all, why wouldn't he stay? And you said you gave us a pretty good picture of why people probably didn't feel there's a lot of prospect there, but he leaves.
He was a scholarship student, right? So he's a brilliant student. He went to the National University of Ireland at University College Dublin, which had been founded by Cardinal Newman in early 1850s and established for the education of the Catholic middle classes primarily, in distinction to the ancient and established university, Trinity College Dublin, which was Protestant. And the sectarian origins of university culture factor to a certain extent in Joyce's understanding of how Irish intellectual life was somewhat of a closed structure to him. At the same time that he was already quite notorious as a teenager for the flashing brilliance of his mind, for having an eidetic memory, right? So that anything he read, he could recite and could recall, but also his gift for languages and for mimicry, right? So he's a great mimic and had the ability to pick up other languages quite quickly. There's a famous story. I always teach Joyce's letter to Ibsen whenever I teach the Joyce colloquium, and what happened was when Joyce was an undergrad at University College Dublin, after going to Belvedere College, another Jesuit school, as a scholarship boy,
right,
he was studying modern languages. So modern languages was basically the sort of philological antecedent of comparative literature, as we would understand it in the 20th century. French, Italian, German, primarily a major directed toward women, right? So the majority of people studying that course over time became dominated by women. So it was an arts degree, and it would lead to work as a teacher primarily. Joyce, as an undergrad, had become electrified by Ibsen's drama. And Ireland, of course, was a drama-mad country, and it was a very interesting question about the long history of drama in Ireland, because there is no Gaelic cultural form of drama. And yet, when it emerged in the 17th century in English, in the Pale in Dublin, through the influence of the Anglo-Irish sort of community, it became immediately attractive, and Irish people took to acting and took to drama and the stage, and especially in the 18th and the 19th century, the London stage is dominated by Irish actors.
Right.
So theater as a form of civic life in Dublin, particularly when Joyce was growing up in the 1890s, is an extraordinarily lively place. Joyce viewed the National Theatre of Ireland, W.B. Yeats's early formation of the Abbey Theatre, as a kind of bourgeois talking shop with very little critical engagement with central political and cultural issues, whereas he saw Ibsen shining a light and sort of and properly sort of spanking the bourgeois soul of the burghers of Christiania, and et cetera. So when Ibsen published When We Dead Awaken, Joyce, as an undergraduate, second-year undergraduate, wrote a review that he sent off to the Fortnightly Review in London, which would be like getting something in the Atlantic or Harper's. Right? So it was a very big deal.
Yeah.
And that was sent to Ibsen. Ibsen read it and wrote to the editor of the Fortnightly Review and said, I have just spelled out, as I can, this very kind review by a man named James Joyce. I should like to congratulate him. I understand he's a young man. The editor sent that to Joyce. Joyce got a letter from Ibsen, right, as an undergrad. And so he did what I think any of us would do. He didn't go to school for 5 weeks, and he taught himself Dano-Norwegian. Right? Literally, he wrote
and he managed to do it, actually.
He managed to do it, and he wrote a letter. This is Joyce's letter to Henrik Ibsen, March 1901. Honored Sir, I write to give you greeting on your 73rd birthday and to join my voice to those of your well-wishers in all lands. You may remember that shortly after the publication of your latest play, When We Dead Awaken, an appreciation of it appeared in one of the English reviews, the Fortnightly Review, over my name. I know that you have seen it because some short time afterwards, Mr. William Archer wrote to me and told me that in a letter he had from you, some days before, you had written, I have read, or rather spelled out a review in the Fortnightly Review by Mr. James Joyce, which is very benevolent and for which I should greatly like to thank the author, if only I had sufficient knowledge of the language. Parentheses, my own knowledge of your language is not, as you see, great, but I trust you'll be able to decipher my meaning. I can hardly tell you how moved I was by your message. I am a very young man, and perhaps the telling of such tricks of the nerves will make you smile. But I am sure if you go back along your own life to the time when you were an undergraduate at the university, as I am, and if you think what it would have meant to you to have earned a word from one who held as high a place in your esteem as you hold in mine, you will understand my feeling. One thing only I regret, namely, that an immature and hasty article should have met your eye rather than something better and worthier of your praise. There may not have been any willful stupidity in it, but truly I can say no more. It may annoy you to have your works at the mercy of striplings, but I am sure you would prefer hot-headedness to nerveless and cultured paradoxes. What shall I say more? I have sounded your name defiantly through the college, where it was either unknown or known faintly and darkly. I have claimed for you your rightful place in the history of the drama. I have shown what, as it seemed to me, was your highest excellence, your lofty impersonal power. Your minor claims, your satire, your technique and orchestral harmony, these too I advanced. Do not think me a hero worshipper, I am not so, and when I spoke of you in debating societies and so forth, I enforced attention by no futile ranting. But we always keep the dearest things to ourselves. I did not tell them what bound me closest to you. I did not say what I could discern dimly of your life was my pride to see, how your battles inspired me, not the obvious material battles,
but those that were fought and won behind your forehead. How your willful resolution to wrest the secret from life gave me heart, and how in your absolute indifference to public canons of art, friends, and shibboleths, you walked in the light of your inward heroism. And this is what I write to you of now. Your work on earth draws to a close, and you are near the silence. It is growing dark for you. Many write of such things, but they do not know. You have only opened the way, though you have gone as far as you could upon it, to the end of John Gabriel Borkman and its spiritual truth. But your last place stands, I take it, apart. But I am sure that higher and holier enlightenment lies onward. As one of the young generation for whom you have spoken, I give you greeting, not humbly because I am obscure and you in the glare, not sadly because you are an old man and I am a young man, not presumptuously nor sentimentally, but joyfully. With hope and with love, I give you greeting.
The letter is a remarkable document. It's astonishing for its expression of Joyce's confidence and ambition, and for the idea that he and Ibsen are on the same, one's young, I am young and you are old, but, I send you greeting. It's actually it's beautiful. It's one of my favorite, very emotional piece to read in class.
But he's young. He's 22 or something.
So, the stories that we're going to get into talking about in a minute, Yuli, these are all written by someone in their early 20s.
That's what I find remarkable. But tell me one more thing about Ibsen. Why is he so interested in a play that comes from a totally different place? And he feels so connected.
So the study of modern languages at UCD, in Ireland in particular, gave a connection to the continent. And the Irish diaspora from the 17th century to Europe created Irish communities of primarily through the Counter-Reformation and through Catholicism and through the spread of Irish colleges on the continent. And also the 1890s, when Joyce is a teenager, Paris is just electrifying the world with its culture of pleasure and of self-expression. Yeah. And Joyce is reading contemporary French poets. I mean, he's reading the symbolists. Not only Joyce, but more broadly in English literary culture. France is making a significant impact. Ibsen's impact, as Toril Moy's great book on Ibsen has shown us, Ibsen's work really was remarkable for the way that it filtered out of the Denmark-Norway constellation to a much broader impact.
And it comes out of its local context, the way Dubliners ultimately in some way will. But I want to ask one more thing before we go. He goes to the continent. So, I know very little about Irish literature. Wilde keeps on trying to be a big deal in London, which he is until he's no longer a big deal and is completely cancelled and sent to prison. Ultimately, Beckett will go to Paris, but why not go to London from Dublin and try to make your big career there?
So, the majority of Irish writers did.
Okay.
Journalists in particular were...
Like one of the characters here who's in the little class.
Yeah, Ignatius Gallagher, who's in Paris, but who's made his mark on the London press.
Who is really annoying, yes.
He's a terrible...
Great, successful writer. He's the full-time staff writer at The New Yorker who we all resent.
Passive-aggressive and in all sorts of ways. So London really was... and in many ways still remains the sort of market that rewards certain kinds of engagement. And Joyce did imagine himself at times as a journalist. And Joyce had a great fascination with journalism and with the press. And it's somewhat present in Dubliners, but it's a massive theme in Ulysses. And Joyce himself made extra money while living in Trieste and writing these stories as a journalist. But the larger question that you're asking about the relationship of London to Dublin, we should remember that W.B. Yeats spent as much time before the age of 30 in London as he did in Dublin. And his father Yeats's father was a painter, pre-Raphaelite painter resident in London. And the Irish community in London was really substantial. And there are a number of Irish authors who do go to London. One writer that I love teaching is Pádraig Ó Conghaire, who's an Irish language writer, whose novel Exile, or Dearcht in Irish, is about a West of Ireland man who goes to London to make his fortune to marry the girl back home and gets hit by a motor car. This is in 1907, and maimed. And it's a novel about disability and madness and the danger of London, right? So from the mid-19th century, especially after the famine, urban life in England was structured around a massive Irish underclass.
Okay.
And so London, Manchester, Liverpool, they represented a certain kind of danger of particularly of drink, right, and of casual labor, becoming a navvy, becoming part of a structured underclass, and also enduring a profoundly anti-Irish racism that was structural in English society in the 19th and parts of the 20th centuries. Okay. So I think Joyce, the bigger question, though, is that his facility with languages, his utter command of English, also meant that the attractions of French and the attractions of Italian and the attractions also of a Catholic culture, where the condescension that Joyce would understand coming from the establishment of Anglo-Ireland would not apply to him. We talked about UCD and Trinity. There's a very famous quote from John Pentland Mahaffey, the professor of Greek and classics at Trinity College Dublin, who, when Joyce became well known, he had this famous statement where he said that young man is proof, if ever proof were needed, what a mistake it was to establish a university for the education of the Aborigines of this island. Right?
And he meant that these voices should have never been heard.
This is the Joyce's foul attention to the body, to sex, to
so we've unleashed some truth we don't want to know about.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So
they're called the Aborigines of this island.
He referred to the Catholics as the Aborigines of this island.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's an index of the sort of Olympian heights to which the professoriate of Trinity ascended and viewed below them the kind of teeming masses. And so Joyce had a class allegiance that at the same time was committed to an ideal of truth and an ideal of truth-telling that I actually believe, I argue that English literature gave to Joyce a profound notion of rebellion and of the Luther statement, "Here I stand, I can do no other," that Joyce takes from Milton and from Blake, a kind of profoundly powerful sense of I cannot say anything but the truth.
And I'm going to stay for one moment here. When you're talking, what I find really interesting, what you're explaining, it's not driven by political resentment that's channeled directly into I'm from the working class, and it's a political, which is not that everybody has to do this, but there are other kinds of literature which is driven more with an overlay of there's a systemic problem here of this inequality, and I'm going to speak against it. It feels more, maybe because he was part of the middle class for a while in his life and enjoyed the education of that, but then he also, as you said, his family fell into misfortune, and he himself was a poor person, and he didn't just look at people and was super educated. He actually was for a moment.
Oh, he made sure that he was economically precarious for his whole life.
Okay.
Right? He guaranteed
not a great financier or something. His sponsor said, he couldn't handle money really. What was it? Or he liked to spend it, or what was it?
He was profligate with it. When he had it, he spent it. That filters very deeply and thematically into Ulysses. Ulysses has a remarkably sensitive attention to this question of Joyce's alter ego character, Stephen Dedalus. But to go back to that question of class and that against which Joyce was rebelling, I've identified Joyce as a Catholic in my remarks so far, and as someone also who takes from a particular tradition of English literature's profoundly assertive sense of the self, right?
Right.
And of truth telling, of art, of the artist as a truth teller. Right? That at the same time has to be set against the idea that Joyce was rebelling against the Catholic Church from the time that he was a teenager. That the idea of a vocation in the priesthood was the avenue toward material security and social respectability and social power in 19th century Ireland. That's a product of the post-famine Catholic Church and its command of the social reality of a society driven by the crisis as it was. So Joyce's decision to bear the truth of his own lack of faith, it structured his break with his family, his break with his mother in particular. And his mother dies after he had left Ireland at the age of 21 to go to Paris, supposedly to study medicine, but really to read. He went to the Library of Sainte-Geneviève, and he sat and he read for 6 months. And he went out and he went to see women dance, right? And he went to restaurants with what little money that he had. But for the most part, he was poor.
So this is your study abroad version with great success. He becomes one of the greatest writers of all time. So he's going to shows.
Yes.
There's someone here, that character, he went to the Moulin Rouge.
Yes,
and it's a very important reference, I guess, to see decadent life, show life, very, very public, spectacular life. And he reads, and that's all he does, and eats in good restaurants, or decent restaurants. Yeah.
There's a few interesting things about that. But more interestingly, I think Joyce was really profoundly attracted to independent women, to women who lived on their own, who made their own way in the world. And these stories are also written when he's a young man who has eloped and is a common law marriage, with a woman that he met June 16th, 1904. Right. He meets Nora Barnacle from Galway. And she was someone working as a chambermaid in a hotel who had no pretensions about her, but who was also independent and was also sexually frank and sexually curious and not judgmental. And that independence from family, church, state, Joyce found it utterly remarkable. So even though there's an enormous gulf in education between the two, she had a profound character of stable ability to thrive in the world and to deal with life practically that he didn't have. So there, there's many marriages that work that way, right? That work with these kinds of differences. But it enabled Joyce to channel all of his cultural energy and erotic energy and his waywardness into a rebellion against the Catholic Church and against Catholic faith, and the construction at the same time of a family, right? And he doesn't get married, but he makes a family, and
he doesn't get married, meaning he doesn't have
they don't. James Joyce and Nora Barnacle don't get married until quite late in their lives, when it was done for practical reasons about entry back into Ireland. And
so that's a very unusual. It's fairly unusual. And some of these stories here, like the boarding house or something, they also say, what are the prospects for anyone, especially for a woman?
Yeah, so the boarding house is, it seems to me, one of Joyce's it's a brilliantly teachable story, because it frankly looks at what happens in forced marriages, or marriages that are marriages of convention, and particularly to men whose masculinity is profoundly damaged. If I were to name one theme in Dubliners that I would most consistently address in my teaching, it's Joyce's attention to the idea that masculinity in Ireland is a really compromised and damaged category of being. And it comes about through I'd say several compelling confluences of forces. One of them is a colonial economy that does not offer avenues towards fulfillment. The other is a rigidly censorious church that operates through the agency of women trying to control men and male life. And then the third is just the sheer precarity of work, right? And add to that a fourth, the manifestation of alcoholism as the signal mode of coping that reinforces the destructiveness that church and state kind of have sown into Irish life in a way that I think scholarship has really shown us is colonial in character. That despite being so integrated into the empire, that the long concussion of the English presence in Ireland has had a direct effect on the structures of masculine personality and masculine strategies of coping and of the emotional life and also the political life of the city, which is really Joyce's keenest desire is to capture political speech as a form of personality that is lost in a way, that has lost its agency and is directed just towards the past and towards the wound of the fall of Parnell.
Let me ask you, this is probably overstating it a little bit, but if you look at Dubliners, and I've never thought of it in this way, you just said, as written under colonial or proto-colonial conditions, because if we use the word colonial literatures or sort of, we usually tend to think of non-European places, ruled and, oppressed by European powers. And you're saying actually Ireland can be read, once you start to read it, you're saying the whole idea of Irish subjectivity is kind of overdetermined by this situation.
The proper term comes from Joyce himself, which is semi-colonial.
Semi-colonial. Okay, so that's actually interesting. So he uses that himself.
Yeah, that's Joyce's term in Finnegan's Wake. But it's a brilliant use of a grammatical term from the English language to talk about Ireland and its neither fish nor fowl status with respect to the colonial world. The idea that it's part of the empire, but always really conditioned by the language shift, right? And and also by the presence, the massive presence in the past of a flourishing literary culture, and the oldest vernacular literature in Europe is in the Irish language. Right? So, and yet it has lost its way in the modern world. So the crucial point, as I teach these issues about how to think of Ireland colonially, first, Ireland is not exceptional in the colonial world at all for the extravagant violence or the ferocity of control, or for the institutional sort of mode by which the satrap forms of colonial power can be infiltrated. It's what distinguishes Ireland is the duration of the colonial concussion, right? That it begins in the 13th century and it has spasmodic moments of waves of settler colonialism, right? That because of the nature of Gaelic society being tribal, right, being largely a very shifting set of allegiances amongst dozens and dozens of forms of kingship and chieftainship that have different modalities. There's no unified kingship in Ireland. There's no feudal system in Ireland. There's a thriving monastic culture in the Middle Ages that is very well adapted to the forms of politics of the Gaelic society. The problem for England, of course, was there was no one to conquer to establish control, right? So it was whack-a-mole. It was literally trying to negotiate with the Irish was an incredibly frustrating experience for English colonial administrators. And it meant really that despite centuries of effort, and particularly with respect to the Reformation, Gaelic culture was sort of cellular in that sense, right? Now the language shift is pronounced. There's 8.5 million people in Ireland in 1845. About 4.5 million of them speak Irish in 1845. When Joyce is a young man at 1900, there's about 125,000 who speak Irish.
Does he know Irish
And
at
Joyce does not. Now, he
and would that have been, so you're saying it's 125, so it's almost wiped out as a language.
Yes, it is. I mean, and it's moved progressively towards the fringe of the country, towards the west coast. There are pockets along the coast in different places.
So you would have heard it occasionally, but it's not.
Now, he would have heard it, and he would have studied it.
Yes.
As part of the Gaelic League. The Gaelic League was founded in 1893 when Joyce is a young man, as part of the language revival movement, which is part of the European-wide cultural nationalist movement that's part of the imperial scramble, but also part of the resurgence of national identity. It's part of the Olympic Games. It's part of the late 19th century modes of being that enforced the Westphalian idea of the universality of the nation state. We could see that leading towards catastrophe in World War I and after. But in Ireland, it's the Home Rule movement, and it's the idea, that it's visible in Ireland that the country has just declined dramatically, and poverty is endemic when England is booming and thriving. Only in one part of Ireland, in the most Protestant part in the Northeast, was there an industrial revolution to speak of.
Right.
So I think Joyce's work and Joyce's relationship to the concept of Irish colonialism really. He's very anxious, and we see it in Gabriel Conroy in The Dead. There's an anxiety about the Irish language. There's an anxiety about the fact that he rebelled against the cultural prescriptions to learn it and to revive it. I think he would rather never speak a language than speak a language poorly, right? And so the modes of education that taught English students to speak French and to speak Italian, to speak German, were more well established in a way than the ad hoc arrangements for teaching Irish in the Gaelic League. He went to lessons. He knew a lot more of the Irish language than most Joyce scholarship gave him credit for a century. But there's a few scholars who've really said, wait, if we look at how much he read in translation, right? Because there was a huge translation effort in the late 19th century, and then psychologically, his sense is that his wife is very close. She's a generation removed from Irish speaking. And Joyce's own family were related to a large Irish-speaking clan in North Mayo and northeast Galway in Ireland, where in the 1880s there was a very famous case of a judicial execution of an Irish speaker who was accused of murder, the Mamtrasna murders, which is a terribly brutal murder in a farmhouse. And a man named Patrick Joyce was tried for it, and he didn't speak English, and his translator didn't speak Irish very well. And so there was an enormous outcry about the execution of Patrick Joyce because the people who were responsible for the murder said he wasn't involved. And I think Joyce had an awareness of a history that he was separated from. And also, we should remember, he left Ireland.
Right, and I want to stay with this language for a moment. So Nora is one generation removed. He is through family, but really, like most people that you're saying in Dublin, removed several generations. And he doesn't believe, it seems to me, and you have to tell me whether this is right, he doesn't believe you can revive this old tradition and move in that direction. He wants to go in another direction. And then when you brought up in boarding house, when the man has to kind of confess his affair with the daughter's Polly.
Yeah.
And he talks to the priest and he feels relieved in a way and also ashamed because the priest kind of makes him tell every detail of this adulterous, this affair. And there was something odd that he's kind of compelled to tell this other man who he is as a man, and he's both ashamed and finally unburdened. But I'm kind of interested what Joyce thinks. What language is available to people under these conditions? And what's remarkable in Dublin is that these people speak and reveal themselves, but not in a way that we would think in a super sophisticated, literary, philosophical way. But he unburdens himself there, and it seems to be a really important moment when you see a man who's finally able to say who he is, but he's not happy with who he is at all.
So a couple of things about that. There's a great phrase by my second teacher of Joyce, a high school teacher of Joyce, but as an undergraduate I studied with Hugh Kenner at Johns Hopkins. And Kenner has a phrase in his first book on Joyce where he said, Joyce excelled more than any other modern writer at constructing plausible limits for expressive competence.
Huh.
It's a brilliant critical phrase.
Plausible limits for expressive confidence.
Right, competence.
Competence, okay.
So in other words, the great example that he uses is in the story The Sisters.
Yeah.
At the very end of the story The Sisters, they're at the wake, and they're talking about James Flynn, the priest who has died, and his sisters refer back to this desire that he had to get a car on one of those rheumatic wheels, those new rheumatic wheels.
She laid a finger against her nose and frowned. Then she continued, "But still and all he kept on saying that before the summer was over he'd go out for a drive one fine day, just to see the old house again, where we were all born down in Irish Town, and take me and Nanny with him. If we could only get one of them newfangled carriages that makes no noise that Father O'Rourke told him about, them with the rheumatic wheels, for the day cheap, he said, at Johnny Rush's over the way there, and drive out the three of us together of a Sunday evening. He'd had his mind set on that. Poor James." "The Lord have mercy on his soul," said my aunt.
Poor James.
Poor James. So interestingly, that story called The Sisters, and it's about the child. It's not so the sisters. It's a very interesting story for a number of reasons, but that idea that she gets rheumatic for pneumatic, right, is a perfect expression of the way that she misuses language correctly. Right?
So tell us for a moment. So just give us a setting of the story. So you just
structurally, we want to think about Dubliners as a whole.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's 14 stories, and they're constructed. Joyce originally planned them with the idea that they were going to move from childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life.
Mm-hmm.
And that was his way of trying to do what he does in all of his work, which is strive towards the concept of totality, of a totalizing imagination.
Mm-hmm.
So in Dubliners, it's a kind of episodic attention to that. And the first story begins with this remarkable construction of how a child, but he's not an adolescent child, and he's not a baby child. He's someone on the cusp of learning,
mm-hmm.
and has enough school learning to teach him something about the mystery of words. And so the word paralysis, which is the master theme for the collection, right? Joyce says, paralysis is the theme that unites all the stories. He views the colonial condition of Ireland as having induced a kind of stasis and paralysis
mm-hmm.
on the emotional and psychological lives of the people of the city. But the character has this priest friend, Father James Flynn, who sits in this back room of his sister's drapery shop, quizzing the little boy about arcana and developing a relationship that the adults in the child's life, his old cotter and his uncle. Interestingly, most of these early stories don't have intact nuclear families.
Right.
Children are being raised by aunts and uncles. That's a sign, again, we should pay attention to in terms of the assumptions we make about family structure,
mm-hmm.
right? And that Joyce is keenly aware of the improvisational nature of family in conditions of precarity and scarcity,
mm-hmm.
right? So, but in this story, what I find most just remarkable is that Joyce centers it in the awareness of the child's apprehension of the way that adults don't speak the truth,
mm-hmm.
and that the use of ellipses in the first pages and the speech of old Cotter circles around the idea that this priest is corrupted in some profound way. Now, it's worth remarking here, right, that in the first two stories of this book, Joyce addresses a priest who is disgraced, who is clearly an addict. He's putting pulverized tobacco up he's trembling, right? There's a theory that he's actually has advanced tertiary syphilis, right? Which and that Joyce takes that from Ibsen, right? From Ibsen's work. But this priest is a broken man, right?
Right.
And the conversation at the end about poor James is reflective back on that broken man. But the child didn't have any perception of the idea that the priest was a broken man.
Yeah.
He just had normalized this life.
Right.
But he picks up after his death on the idea that the adults had an anxiety about the child, and that it's centered on the body. It's centered on healthfulness, right? So the uncles
Says you should go out.
box your own corner, right?
Yeah.
He mentions taking a cold bath every morning, right? Which explicitly raises this question about sex and bodily discipline. But the interesting question about the opening stories is they both name sort of sexual deviancy or potential sexual deviancy. And that's a matter that it took a century to emerge.
And the second
into
story,
Irish cultural
in
life.
an encounter, tell us what happens there.
Well, in an encounter, these two boys are reading American adventure stories in school, right? They're hiding in these sensational novels, and they get this idea of going on an adventure, right? And taking a ferry and going out to the Pigeon House, to Bull Island in the middle of Dublin Bay. But along the way, they wind up at a specific location that Joyce sets quite a lot of crucial moments in his fiction. So an encounter takes place just at the bottom of Sandymount in Dublin Bay, and it's there's a field there where an encounter takes place. It's also near where Stephen Dedalus has his vision of the bird girl and A Portrait of the Artist, and it's also where Bloom and Gertie McDowell in the Nausicaa section of Ulysses have this very complicated experience together. But in an encounter, the boys, these two boys encounter this man who quizzes them at first very aggressively about what books they've read and what kinds of dangerous topics they might have encountered in their reading. And he tries to make a difference between the two boys about one being a smart one, another being a bad one. And then he gets this entranced look in his eyes and he goes to the other end of the field. And it's not narrated what he does, but it's fairly clear from the inference that he masturbates. And they say, I say, look at what he's doing. And then he comes back and his language is dramatically changed and he's angry and he's talking about discipline and whipping boys.
He said that my friend was a very rough boy and asked did he get whipped often at school. I was going to reply indignantly that we were not national schoolboys to be whipped, as he called it, but I remained silent. He began to speak on the subject of chastising boys. His mind, as if magnetized again by his speech, seemed to circle slowly round and round its new center. He said that when boys were that kind, they ought to be whipped and well whipped. When a boy was rough and unruly, there was nothing would do him any good but a good, sound whipping. A slap on the hand or a box on the ear was no good. What he wanted was to get a nice, warm whipping. I was surprised at this sentiment and involuntarily glanced up at his face. As I did so, I met the gaze of a pair of bottle-green eyes peering at me from under a twitching forehead. I turned my eyes away again.
Now, the interesting features of that, and this is where Joyce teaches us to read very carefully for detail, because that elderly man has nice clothes that are very shabby. He has bad teeth, but his accent is very refined, and he has a very advanced literary education, and he's professes to be very widely read. And he's also someone who is a sexually unanchored person who's clearly inappropriately engaging with young little boys, right? So the idea, it seems to me, that the story reinforces it, but you look at the details of an otherwise frightening and reprehensible man, you pick up on the idea that the child is fascinated by the idea of what made this guy become what he is. Mm-hmm. Why does he not have a place in the world? Why is he in the middle of the afternoon masturbating in a field near these children who are playing hooky?
Right.
I think it connects to go back to the boarding house. One of the crucial things about Bob Doran, who marries Polly under the force of having gotten her pregnant after Mrs. Mooney, the madam of the house. Mrs. Mooney dealt with moral problems as a cleaver deals with meat. right? This very
who is the mother of the boarding house, where her daughter works, and then this is a tenant in the boarding house,
Yes.
and she observes this affair unfold, and it's
stays back from it,
and she doesn't
lets it happen.
intervene as if until it's ripe for
Polly is in the family way, as they would say.
Polly knew that she was being watched, but still her mother's persistent silence could not be misunderstood. There had been no open complicity between mother and daughter, no open understanding, but though people in the house began to talk of the affair, still Mrs. Mooney did not intervene. Polly began to grow a little strange in her manner, and the young man was evidently perturbed. At last, when she judged it to be the right moment, Mrs. Mooney intervened. She dealt with moral problems as a cleaver deals with meat, and in this case she had made up her mind.
And the question is, why? Why is that his only option?
Yeah.
How does this work? And the reason why is because Bob Doran has a job where with a Catholic wine merchant, right? So if there's anything that's a stable business in Dublin, it's a wine merchant. And actually, it's the wine merchant that's in that story still exists. It's a block away from Trinity College, still there. But Joyce's attention to the connection between religion and the political economic decision making means that Mrs. Mooney chose Bob Doran because of his job, and knew that working for a Catholic wine merchant, there's no way he would give up his job by ditching on a young pregnant girl, because she would immediately go and he'd get him fired.
And Mrs. Mooney at that moment thinks of all the mothers who can't get their daughters off their hands. So suddenly she turns into someone who's not protecting her daughter, but realizes she's been scheming to get her daughter married off to this guy who got her pregnant.
Because Polly's a mouth to feed.
Yeah.
Right? She refers to her literally as a mouth to feed. Right? And then Joyce also pays attention. Again, every detail is significant. Joyce also pays attention to the way that Polly's mouth is that of a perverse little Madonna. Right? So he pays attention to the erotic shape of her mouth and to her attractiveness, but also to the idea that it connects with a perverse Madonna, with the compelling sexual attractiveness of this terrifying holy symbol, right? Which again evokes a whole range of Catholic prohibitions on the body that James Joyce himself would struggle with, and that his again Stephen Dedalus would become central to A Portrait of the Artist.
And if we stay, the end of an encounter, a lot of the stories end in these very unexpected ways. I think it's become a model in the 20th century in a way, sort of how to end a story or not end it. And then in the encounter, they go out, they want to have an adventure, they read Wild West stories, but then they go into the bay, as you said. Then they find this man who basically, in some sense, actually, whatever word we want to use, he accosts them or harasses them or abuses them only through language. He keeps on upping it every single time. He first talks about, what are you studying? Then you must be a bad boy. You should be whipped. Do you have a girlfriend? What would you do with a girlfriend? I want a pretty girlfriend. And it becomes more and more sexual. But it's only language.
Yes.
As far as we know, he doesn't touch them, doesn't come close to them. And it's kind of unsettling. And then at the very end, I'm kind of curious whether you think they go home and they had their adventure, which is not at all what they expected. They got exactly what they could have never had imagined, really.
That's right.
And this is the ending is really odd, because the two boys they reconnect, and they have to be reconnected because otherwise they're vulnerable to this man. But not in a happy way, we got out of this, but in a kind of inconclusive way. Something happened, and then I guess they gave each other fake names to deceive this man. And then he says at the end, he ran, the friend runs to him, he ran as if to bring me aid, and I was penitent, for in my heart I had always despised him a little. Yeah. What do you make of, what happened in that story, which is the beginning, as you said, these three stories, which are about childhood?
Yeah. So I think the crucial part about this is Joyce is constructing a perspective on the world of the sensitive child and the sensitive reader, right? So The Sisters is all about interpretation, gnomon, the gnomon. It's literally the child's trying to figure out what it means when people don't say what they mean. And he's trying to figure out all the symbols of life that are around him and struggling to make meaning of his half-finished sentences with the priest, right? In an encounter, the the child's decision based on reading to go out and have an adventure, reading and literature motivate him to go out into the world. He goes out into the world, and what he experiences is not what he thought was going to happen to him. And at that moment, the difference between the sensitive boy who has read all the books and the kid who goes off, and this is a perfect image, the Murphy, who the other child, goes off to chase a cat. Right? So, I mean, to give the perfect thing of an unthinking, non-intellectual child goes off to chase a cat, while the narrator converses with the strange man. And then we have this beautiful reversal about the community of the two being reestablished in relationship to the threat. But the child realizes that I'm not like him. I mean, I always despised him a little. He'd always been a little more coarse, a little more physically rambunctious or violent or something. And so the problem for the intellectual is, what do you do with your insight? What do you do with your relationship to community if really what it does is give you a vision of the world that's not comforting, that's not, and yet at the same time he wishes that he were not the person who had been singled out by the old man.
But that's interesting that the perceptiveness of a literate child, or a very precocious, or someone who uses intelligence. Murphy's more of a person of action, runs around, chases the cat, throws rocks at the cat. But it doesn't produce in the first one empathy in a good way. He's actually open to other people, but these people are very unpredictable and unreliable, like people are.
Yeah.
And it doesn't start you out on a program in these first three stories. The next one, Araby, where he tries to buy a present for the girl he loves. It fails grandiosely in buying this little trinket. But there's something that you open yourself up to others. And what we call empathy, I think here means others are different from you. Yeah. It doesn't mean you're now connected and there's a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling of shared humanity, but actually shared humanity in Dubliners is the exposure to this huge range of humanity.
Yes. And the idea of comfort is really not present. The idea of there's just not a comforting world. Insight is at the cost of alienation. And it's offered as what literature does. So literature will give you insight, but it will produce an alienation from innocence and from naivete.
I think that's quite important. I'm staying with this for a moment because there's this kind of general understanding that literature teaches you empathy, that people should read more novels. And in our divided world, you hear this every single day. Everybody says, oh, people should read more books or watch movies. And what you're saying is quite different, a bit more nuanced, to say we will get to know others, but it doesn't mean we actually are like them or we even understand them. We maybe even realize we cannot understand them. And that is already, that's a kind of a distanced connection. It's not, oh, I get who they are and I can see. Actually, in these stories, people encounter each other and are completely at a loss because they realize the other person is motivated by other things, wants different things. It doesn't map onto what you want. So I think here, alienation is not the opposite of connection. It's a deepening of connection, that actually humanity is very, very disparate.
I agree with you thoroughly. I would argue in a longer perspective beyond Dubliners that Joyce is leading toward overcoming, in the course of his life, toward overcoming this sense of a fallen and corrupted humanity that the gift of intelligence produces, not necessarily contempt. Now, there's not an intellectual contempt running through these stories. There's an observational commitment to clarity of perspective and to an unrelenting dedication to the truth as it is seen, right? And the letters that Joyce wrote, these stories had a very hard time being published. It took a decade.
Remarkable.
Yeah.
I actually think that's quite important that he tried several, and the people were afraid to publish them, and it took him over 10 years.
Yeah, it took about 8 years.
8 years, yeah.
Yeah, 9 years. 1915 when they finally get published, and the printers making objections to language and to aspects of the stories, and so there are remarkable passages in the letters to Grant Richards, to the publisher, where Joyce talks about what he's doing and why he's doing it.
He says something really. I think there's one letter that I saw somewhere. He says something like, "You retard the progress of civilization itself," or something like that.
Yeah, if you don't publish them. I actually have one. I can read a little quote here. Right? As for my part and share in the book, I have already told all I have to tell. My intention was to write a chapter of the moral history of my country, and I chose Dublin for the scene because that city seemed to me the center of paralysis. I have tried to present it to the indifferent public under 4 of its aspects: childhood, adolescence, maturity, and public life. The stories are arranged in this order. I have written it for the most part in a style of scrupulous meanness, and with the conviction that he is a very bold man who dares to alter in the presentment, still more to deform, whatever he has seen and heard. I cannot do any more than this. I cannot alter what I have written. All these objections to which the printer is now the mouthpiece arose in my mind when I was writing the book, both as to the themes of the stories and their manner of treatment. Had I listened to them, I would not have written the book. I have come to the conclusion that I cannot write without offending people. That goes back to the question about the truth.
Mm-hmm.
The question about empathy, I think Joyce as a young man is less concerned with empathy. I think he's much more concerned with defiance, with proving people wrong. Right? Over the course of his work, and particularly in Ulysses, there's a much greater investment in the idea of the everyday becoming redemptive through the power of the mind to reflect on the sheer unlikelihood of being alive, right, and of living with other human beings, and living in culture, and living in history, and living in time. All of that, I think, is a work that Joyce goes through stagily, and then ultimately, I think he tries to do too much in a way with Finnegan's Wake to construct a book that is the whole history of all forms of empathy and all forms of connection. But I think you get at something very important about the idea that the stories, what do they produce? Like, what do they do to the reader? Right? My own view is the reason why James Joyce is so wonderful to read, and why it is such a gift and such a joy to me to teach, is because he teaches you how to read. He teaches you how to read him. Right? You have to pay attention to detail in order to understand these stories. From the very beginning, they ask you to reflect on the meaning of words, and they ask you to understand that people don't often say what they mean, and they often say things that actually try to hide what they mean. And so from the very beginning, one way to understand Dubliners is as a drama of interpretation, a drama of occluded meaning, and a drama of the struggle that reading is just a gift to us in our attempt to understand the world.
And you mean reading not as a decoding of some other meaning, right? It's not you listen closely, you get it right, but you get the fact that people also misspeak or don't tell you what they mean.
Yes.
Because reading isn't, I'm going to ask you over and over until I get it. That's actually this idea that there's some transparency ultimately. I think here what you're saying is, in the beginning, the child and the young man, they listen to each other and realize this person doesn't mean what they say, or maybe doesn't even know what they want to say.
They don't know that they don't.
They don't know. That's what he said. Occluded. It's occluded to themselves, but that doesn't mean they're ignorant or stupid. They don't know who they are to themselves in this moment, and therefore they cannot properly communicate their motivation or their intention or something like that.
That's great. So, Uli, this leads us to one crucial dimension of technique in the stories, right? So we talk about plot and social representation, character, sociological forces in history, etc. But technically, at the level of the sentence, Joyce over the course of Dubliners, became increasingly attuned to the capacities of free, indirect discourse to allow narration to take on the color of personality and to shift imperceptibly, to move. I mean, I think The Dead is the great masterwork of Joyce's early style and of the book. And it begins with, of course, with I think the most teachable and the most notable instance of free indirect discourse, right? Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. And I always begin that story with an attention to the idea that, did James Joyce make a mistake not know the difference between literal and figurative? We know that he knew the difference between literal and figurative, but Lily didn't, right? And so that story begins with a servant girl being overwhelmed with what she's being asked to do. And then she narrates her position in this household with these old women and what kind of work she does. Right. And then that leads into our perspective on her being interrupted by the arrival of the man, of Gabriel Conroy, right? Who immediately makes mistakes with her, right? And asks her about men, and then we realize that she's encountered the guys in 2 Gallants earlier in the book, right? She's the men that is now is only all palaver and what they get out of you.
And they get out of her a coin.
A coin, in 2 Gallants they do. I mean, that's not Lily, because that's a country girl who's dressed very poorly.
But that's like Lily.
Yes, it is. So first that attention to the servant class is really remarkable, right? And it recalls Bruce Robbins' brilliant work on the servant's hand and the importance of the invisible servant structure and labor structure in the Victorian novel. Joyce is very aware of who's in his stories and what they do. But with Lily, Gabriel asks her 2 questions. He gets these things wrong. He's like, so you're still in school? And she's like, well, no, I'm out of school this year and more. In other words, I wasn't in school last year when I saw you, and I'm still not in school. And his immediate assumption is she's going to get married, and that's not for me because of the way that men are.
Right.
And he takes it personally. He gets incredibly flustered, and he gives her money. And so we get this exchange of money going back to the servant girl that was taken earlier out of the guilt of a bourgeois man, who quickly we learn, I think, to read that story as a story about someone for whom women are central in his life and whose relationships with women are so important to him. And yet, despite being an intellectual, in fact, perhaps because he's an intellectual, he's screened the reality of women's lives from himself. Okay. He's had an ability to construct in his head an understanding of women that's kept him at a distance. And so Lily says, in the story, the only thing that, in her narration, the third person narration, the only thing that the Mrs. Morkins won't stand is back answers. And then we see Gabriel getting back answers from Lily, back answers from Greta, back answers from Molly Ivers.
So there are 3 women, and he goes into this event. It's his aunt's house. He's the nephew. Lily is the servant girl. Molly is another guest
who went to university with Gabriel and studied modern languages,
and who criticizes him for something he wrote or
for writing a review. In an English newspaper.
And he's
in
totally
the Daily Mail.
unsettled. He's he's sort of the star of the party. He gives the toast. He's kind of, everybody wants him to be there. You kind of get excited for him. It's like another party scene, and you're thinking, wow, this is going to be great. And then even before he checks his coat, he's already totally flustered, screws it up even more by kind of humiliating himself and Lily by giving her this money, which is inappropriate. Then Molly criticizes him, and he's completely unsettled again and gets defensive and says, I'm going to take this out on Molly at the expense of my aunts. And you're thinking, wow, this man is really invested of what women think of him, but somehow can't get to let them even see him.
Yeah. So I think that broader architecture of women's relationships really does structure the story, but it moves towards the conclusion of the story. And I think there again, when teaching this story, which is one of the great gifts that as a literature scholar and a literature professor that I can experience, the stagial movement of this evening that really celebrates the life of the middle class
Yeah.
and its pretensions.
Yeah.
And this is a generous story in the sense that these are people who have a life filled really with music, right? The aunts are devoted to music. They've been kicked out of the choir by the Pope, so there's an interesting thing there. And they're maintained by their niece, again, a broken household. They're maintained by the niece who teaches contemporary music. But it's an evening of dancing, it's an evening of performances, and it's an evening of conversation about music. And all of the details of that are rich, and they bear a great deal of attention and conversation and discussion. But the point is that all leads towards the way that this one song, sung casually at the very end of the night, sparks this intense emotional experience in Greta Conroy, Gabriel's wife.
Mm-hmm.
And Gabriel is constantly accommodating himself, arranging himself, forcing himself into the position of who he is, of who he thinks he is, who he thinks he should be, right? And one of the things that he thinks he should be is a lover. And this is a night he's going to be a lover because the kids are at home. Every married person knows how important this is.
A night in the hotel.
A night in the hotel, exactly, where we're free to be ourselves and we're not we're in privacy, right? And so he's looking forward to this moment of pleasure and of connection to his wife. And this song that comes out of two pasts. It comes out of her past, because a boy used to sing it, and that's why she's entranced by it. But it also comes out of the past of Irish history, because the song is about a jilted woman, a lover, from a place in Galway called Aughrim, which is where the last stand of the Catholics in the Williamite Wars took place in 1691. After the defeat at the Battle of the Boyne, it's where, and the victories of William of Orange, it's where the Catholic Confederation under Patrick Sarsfield is finally smashed, and where the wild geese then finally leave Ireland. And so it's a song about a lover being bereft and jilted by an aristocrat, but it's also a song that evokes the loss of the Catholic hopes, the loss of the Stuart Jacobite pretension to restitution, to Gaelic supremacy. So all of that is in the background, but Gabriel doesn't know it, right? And as someone who writes reviews of English poetry in the English papers and who goes to the continent to keep up with the languages and to be a successful intellectual, right? The fact is that what's closest to him is that his wife, whom he says, you'll remember in the conversation with Molly Ivors says, will you come to us to the Aran Islands? Will Greta come too? She's from Connacht, isn't she? And Gabriel says, her people are. And that's not true. I mean, she grew up there. She lived in Galway as a child, and she spent time with her grandmother, who still lived in Galway. So Gabriel has this idea that she is from Dublin. She's from Blackrock, where he lives, the salubrious thing. And he's trying in a way to ring fence this question of Irish. And he explodes. He says, Irish is not my language, right? And Molly Ivors, she does not wear a low-cut bodice, right? And she's got this buttoned-up thing. She challenges him sexually, she challenges him culturally, she challenges him intellectually, and he can't risk a grandiose phrase with her, which is the phrase that's used. All of this leads to this moment where Gabriel thinks that he's going to have this reunion, and it doesn't happen, right, with his wife. And because she's overcome by the memory of this young boyfriend, lover, friend, who she thinks died for him because he stayed out and got a cold and dies of TB. Right, which is a scourge in Ireland at the time. It's really, it's shot through every Irish family's experience of TB in this period before 1920. So what I want to bring the conversation towards is the lyricism that emerges at the end of The Dead.
Right.
Is these mellifluous, gorgeously structured, chiasmic sentences, right? And this expansion of observation and consciousness that has this power of reaching toward a communion with the dead, and the idea of something, the snow, the imagery of the snow, unifying the living and the dead. The way I've come to understand that is that the crisis that the story constructs for Gabriel Conroy and the defeat of his hopes, the defeat of his pretensions. The question is, what does it lead him to an awareness of? And I think that the narration of that story and the free indirect discourse merges from centering in Gabriel's mind, and it gradually expands out. And the way I've come to understand this now is by really through some electrifying work in the philosophy of mind that's emerged in the last 2 decades. It's associated with affect theory and particularly with theories of consciousness that seek to get outside of the idea of consciousness being seated in the brain, and that understand that consciousness is something that's reciprocal, that's actually social, it's based in language, but it's always dependent on the other, right? And Gabriel's thoughts at the conclusion of The Dead and their radical expansion and movement, they seem to me to give a really profound iteration of what Al-Vanoui refers to as getting out of our heads, and which means also getting out of ourselves, getting over ourselves, right? Which is what Gabriel needs. He needs to get over himself and become a listener, right? To recognize that these women are real. They're actually as alive as he is.
He had never felt like that himself towards any woman, but he knew that such a feeling must be love. The tears gathered more thickly in his eyes, and in the partial darkness he imagined he saw the form of a young man standing under a dripping tree. Other forms were near. His soul had approached that region where dwell the vast hosts of the dead. He was conscious of, but could not apprehend, their wayward and flickering existence. His own identity was fading out into a gray, impalpable world. The solid world itself, which these dead had one time reared and lived in, was dissolving and dwindling. A few light taps upon the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the newspapers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the Bog of Allen, and, farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling, too, upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end, upon all the living and the dead.
What's really beautiful while you're describing this, that this consciousness is not about deepening your own consciousness as a separate entity, but at the end of The Dead, I also think strangely at the end of A Painful Case, he sees himself now not lost because his wife had this lost lover and he's disconnected and she rejects him and he's very disappointed, sexually frustrated. He's like, then he finally lays down next to her on the bed, and then he thinks, but I'm actually connected on a different level. I actually also will fade in people's memory. I will also be forgotten like this boy who I didn't want to remember, who is a disruption in my life. He's suddenly this thing of anger, like I didn't even know my wife had this. Yeah. But instead of staying there, he says, but we all will be these things that someone else will not know, but someone will have great meaning attached. It's very beautiful how and it's what you're saying in the language, it moves very gradually. And he falls asleep and there's snow and you're thinking, is it just falling asleep? But he's not falling asleep in a simple way. He's actually lapsing from one state of consciousness, which is defended, the beginning of the story.
Yes, that's right.
I'm this male, these women are to this woman who's next to me. He looks at her as if he hadn't been married to her. He said, we're actually connected, but not in the way I thought. Yes. That I own or know or can take charge of her. There's this very close to a rape idea, like I'm going to take possession. But instead he says, I'm disconnected. And that disconnection, we're all in this.
Yes, that's right.
It's very beautiful, you're right. But it's actually, the language goes there.
The language performs the expansion of consciousness or the recognition that his own consciousness. He says, one thing that he observes is how small a part he played in her life. Now, that's a brilliant phrase in the story because it's not accurate, right? It is part of his overstatement, of his defensiveness, as it is diminishing.
Yeah.
And so he did play an enormous part in her life. He's the father of her children. He's his companion. But in terms of figuring her autonomy and her separate consciousness, the question is, what part does anyone play in anyone else's life? And the idea or the ideal of a marriage as a totalizing blending of consciousness, I think Joyce is very interested in the idea of the autonomy of the individual, but of the crucial interdependence of every self for the gift of selfhood, right? That selfhood is something that is not an individualized possession. We only know it through a language, right? That is not, it's the common possession of all, not the singular possession of one. I think that's one of the reasons why Joyce makes Gabriel an English teacher, right? And a literature teacher is because he thinks that his mastery over language makes him a master over language. But in fact, language is always his master. It always exceeds his control over it. And if he doesn't have humility, if he doesn't have the humility to think that I'm merely someone who is part of something,
right?
And the other point about language is the real people who give it to us are dead, right? The people who really shape it are not the people who are speaking it, but the people who gave it to the people who speak it. And that's true figuratively in a beautiful way through the idea of the song, right? And so in Irish culture, there's an idea that the song borrows the singer, right? Right? That the song borrows the singer for a little while, and then it goes to another singer who hears it. And the idea of the culture respecting people who carry a tune, who carry many tunes, the culture carriers, right? They're the people to be respected because you can go to them and you can get something from the past that it would otherwise disappear, and everything disappears, right? So music gives us a way of thinking about consciousness as something that we're borrowing out of a larger source of things, right? And I think essentially that idea of, it's also figured in a musical instrument, right? So in a folk culture, the idea is, you don't burn an instrument when a person dies. It goes to a child or it goes to someone else. And then one way to think about the song is, that flute, that was being played in the 1840s. It'll be played 100 years from now. What role does the individual subject play in relationship to that? And I think that beautiful movement at the conclusion of The Dead, and the idea that the lyrical agency, the spectacular, soft, warm, reassuring sound of the sentences comes not from Gabriel's supervening consciousness, from his creativity, but it's as if, what many poets will say is that I'm a medium for the language. I'm not in charge of what I'm saying much of the time. A lot of things, I didn't put it there. The poem came to me and let me speak the poem. It was there when I found it that way. And I think Joyce really believed that the agency of poetry wasn't just in the hands of the poet, and that Gabriel is not a poet. He's someone, and yet at the same time, he's someone who Joyce uses to get his most beautiful. I mean, that last paragraph I think is the most beautiful in a way that Joyce ever allowed himself to write, because he's very suspicious of the facility of the Irish with cadence and rhythm and rhyme, and there's a sort of sense in which that can be an easy kind of thing. So
but this is a nice way to end, I think, to say there's something at the end of this book that opens up something, and it's called The Dead, and you think, oh really? But the dead are with us through language, which is really beautiful. I think the way you end this, and to say actually that consciousness is not sort of your supervening ego controlling this, but letting go in some ways.
And the movement into sleep is a way to move into the collective sense of the loss of consciousness, which is also being alive at the same time, right? So I think that idea that beauty exists beyond our possession of it, and that we're lucky to catch it, right? And that's what Dubliners really is. It teaches us how to read, and I think it teaches us at the end to pay attention, especially to how free and direct discourse opens up to the other.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
That is a really wonderful conversation. So I want to thank you again, John Waters, who is my colleague here at New York University, for opening up the beauty of Dubliners. James Joyce.
Thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Collection, and then I hope to have you back on for Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses or the Portrait of the Art.
The centenary of Ulysses is in February.
So we can do that in February. That would be wonderful, and it's also Joyce's birthday month, right? That's February 2nd. So thank you for being a guest on Think About It, and I hope to have you as a guest on the show again.
Thank you, Willie.